When Jesus walked the dusty paths of Galilee, the world beyond that hill was already vast, varied, and surprisingly connected. Let's take a trip across continents and oceans to see what else was happening roughly 2,000 years ago. Not because we want to make the past into a gallery of curiosities, but because understanding those simultaneous lives helps us see how people, goods, and ideas moved across the planet long before modern maps and modern machines. Imagine Rome first, the city itself a roar of voices, a stone and marble machine of public life. Under the Pax Romana, a relative stability enforced by roads, legions, and law, cities grew, markets thrummed, and the Mediterranean functioned like a highway between very different peoples. Roman aqueducts carried water into public baths and private homes. Paved roads threaded the provinces together. Coins and passports of a sort allowed merchants and soldiers to operate across great distances. Urban life in Rome could be loud and cosmopolitan. You might hear Latin and Greek, meet refugees from the eastern provinces, buy spices that came overland from Arabia or by ship from Egypt, or pay a sculptor who modeled a foreign god into a Roman temple. Philosophies and cults jostled for attention, Stoicism, mystery religions, and local traditions, and the city's appetite for spectacle made theater and public ritual essential parts of daily life. But Rome was only one node on a crowded map. While Roman senators debated in marble halls, a different kind of knowledge was being curated on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. Alexandria in Egypt was a hub of learning, a library and museum complex that gathered texts from across the Hellenistic world. Within those halls, scholars compared manuscripts, mapped the stars, and attempted measurements that aimed to grasp the size of the world. One of the more famous stories tells of Eratosthenes, a scholar who used reports of shadows in different cities, geometry, and the distance between those cities to estimate the Earth's circumference. The method is elegant in its simplicity and also a reminder where there are networks of texts and travelers, knowledge can accumulate and be tested. Alexandria's collections and its scholars preserved lines of thought that would have been fragile in the face of time. Meanwhile, across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, a rising kingdom in the Horn of Africa was carving a place for itself in that same web of exchange. Aksum, or Aksum, emerged as an important trading center, linking the African interior, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean world. Aksumite merchants moved goods like incense, ivory, and possibly gold between inland Africa and cosmopolitan ports. Monumental stelae still stand as silent witnesses to the kingdom's organization and power. Evidence suggests that Aksum's location and maritime connections allowed it to act as a conduit. Information, objects, and people passed through its ports and caravans in both directions, making it more than a regional player. It was part of a long-distance economy that reached into the Roman world and across the Indian Ocean. To the northeast of the Mediterranean, a very different political formation held sway, the Parthian Empire. Far from a monolithic state, Parthia functioned as a federative set of realms under a king who could be called King of Kings. Its elite cavalry, famed horse archers, could influence the balance of power with Rome, and the Parthian control over stretches of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau made it a key custodian of overland trade. Caravans moving silk, spices, metals, and ideas traversed these routes. Parthia's political structure, which allowed considerable local autonomy under broader suzerainty, meant that traders and diplomats negotiated with a patchwork of authorities as they moved east and west. That patchwork was both a challenge and an advantage. It preserved a diversity of local practices while enabling the flow of goods across vast distances. South and east from there, the Indian subcontinent was a driver of its own networks. This period still carried the memory and influence of earlier imperial formations. Ashoka's reign, for example, had promoted Buddhism and left visible traces in inscriptions and monuments. Evidence suggests that Buddhist ideas and communities continued to spread, aided by both overland corridors and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. Ports along India's western and eastern coasts connected to Arabia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. Monsoon winds, well understood by mariners, made seasonal sailing reliable and predictable. In the northwest, an artistic fusion emerged in places like Gandhara, where Hellenistic forms mixed with Buddhist themes to produce sculptures with Greco-Roman drapery rendered around distinctly Indian iconography. Those works are physical evidence of cultural entanglement shaped by trade, migration, and the movement of artisans and religious ideas. Farther east, the Han Dynasty in China anchored a civilization whose scale and bureaucratic reach were truly impressive. Han China supported a population in the tens of millions and developed a state apparatus framed by Confucian principles and an examination-based elite recruitment over time. Chinese artisans produced silk that became highly prized in Western markets. That silk was one of the commodities whose demand fueled long-distance exchange. Technological innovation in Han China included precursors to paper and mechanical inventions that speak to a sophisticated culture of scholarship and administration. One famous example, attributed to a later Han engineer, is an early seismological device, an attempt to register distant earthquakes, which illustrates how scientific curiosity took practical forms. Evidence suggests that China's bureaucratic and technical systems allowed complex information and goods to be produced and organized on a scale few other states matched. If Han China was a continental heavyweight, Japan was at a different point on the developmental curve. The Yayoi period on the Japanese archipelago saw the spread of wet rice agriculture, new pottery styles, and the first signs of more extensive metal use, but political authority remained fragmented and local. Contact with the continent brought technologies and crops that would later underpin more centralized polities. Yet in the 1st century CE, Japan looked like a periphery in the sense of being less centralized rather than less creative. Different environmental constraints and social strategies produced a very different rhythm of change. Crossing the vast Pacific, we emerge at another set of human experiments, the islands of Oceania and the cultures of the Americas. Polynesian voyaging and expansion across the Pacific were astonishing feats of navigation, but many of the most distant islands that later became part of a broad Polynesian world were colonized after the 1st century CE. So in the era we're surveying, much of the Pacific remains sparsely populated in terms of long-distance contact. The pattern of colonization continued, but attained its greatest reach in later centuries. The Americas, however, hosted remarkable urban and intellectual achievements that developed independently of Eurasian dynamics. In central Mexico, Teotihuacan was rising as a major urban center with monumental pyramids, broad avenues, and a population that may have numbered in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Estimates vary and should be presented with caution. Its scale and organization suggest sophisticated planning and social complexity. To the south and east, Maya polities in what is now Mexico and Guatemala refined calendars, astronomy, and writing systems. They developed precise observational records that allowed them to predict celestial events and construct elaborate ritual calendars. Evidence shows the Maya had a sophisticated numeral system and an early conceptualization of zero, which had profound implications for calculations and astronomy. These developments were independent and regionally specific, yet they matched, in their own way, the intellectual ambitions seen in Eurasia. In South America, especially in regions corresponding to modern Brazil, people pursued a range of adaptations to diverse environments. Some communities were hunter-gatherers who seasonally exploited marine and terrestrial resources. Others practiced forms of sedentary agriculture. Shell mound sites, known locally as sambaquis, mark long-term, complex uses of coastal zones, sometimes with elaborate deposits of shells and artifacts. Ceramic traditions developed in various places, and archaeological evidence suggests regionally sophisticated pottery production long before European contact.
Metal use, by contrast, was uneven and often limited in many parts of South America during this period. Where metallurgy existed, it took distinctive local forms rather than following a single global pattern. Our view here is shaped by what survives. Stone and ceramic remain, while wooden structures and textiles decay, so archaeological visibility varies a great deal. What ties all these disparate places together is connectivity, not uniform or instantaneous, but a network of routes and exchanges that included land and sea. The so-called Silk Roads were not a single road, but a series of linked pathways across Central Asia through which silk, horses, glass, and ideas moved. Maritime routes across the Indian Ocean used predictable wind patterns, the monsoons, allowing sailors to plan voyages between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Goods like spices, textiles, metals, and precious stones moved on these routes. Along with them traveled artisans, religious ideas, and technologies. That flow was uneven and often mediated by middlemen, the merchants of the Arabian Peninsula, the port cities of India, the caravans that crossed Parthian lands, the mariners of Aksum. Information spread as well. Arithmetic techniques, artistic motifs, and religious concepts sometimes crossed enormous distances and were reworked in new contexts. But we must be careful about how we describe these connections. Archaeology and ancient texts provide fragments, not a continuous film. Preservation biases shape our view. Durable materials like stone, pottery, and metal survive better than wood, textiles, and many organic items. Literate societies that produced archives leave a different kind of trail than oral cultures. A thriving library preserves different things than a pottery workshop does. Alexandria's library, for example, represented a concentration of written records that made the Mediterranean intellectual world especially visible to later historians. But the loss of those collections also created gaps. When a library burns or texts decay, knowledge can vanish in ways that are hard to reconstruct. That is why a single inscription, a recovered scroll fragment, or a previously unexplored tomb can rewrite parts of a region's history. New evidence reshapes our understanding. To bring those abstract contrasts into a human scale, consider a few micro-stories. Picture a merchant in an Alexandrian marketplace around the time of Jesus. He might have dealt in papyrus scrolls and spices, and he would have heard news from sailors who had crossed from India. In another place and style of life, imagine a trader from Aksum loading amphorae and bundles of ivory onto a dhow, preparing for a voyage across the Red Sea to ports where Roman merchants might pick up those goods.
On overland routes, a Parthian courier might ride to a satrapal center to negotiate passage, while in northwestern India, a sculptor in Gandhara would be shaping a Buddha's robe in a style that echoed Greek drapery, evidence of artisans learning techniques and motifs that had traveled with people. In China, a Han official might be copying administrative texts, while silk weavers prepared bolts that would one day be prized in distant markets. And in the Americas, an urban planner in Teotihuacan organized the alignment of a plaza and pyramid that shaped ritual life for thousands. These snapshots underscore a key point: simultaneity. At roughly the same moment that a teacher spoke on a hill in Judea, people across the world were building monumental architecture, organizing complex states, producing scholarship, sailing oceans, and charting the stars in ways that mattered deeply to their communities. Those worlds did not exist in isolation. They were linked by exchange, migration, emulation, and sometimes conflict. Let's pause briefly. If you're enjoying this global tour and want more contextual deep dives on places like Alexandria, Teotihuacan, or Han, China, subscribe and check the links in the description for our sources and related videos. Returning to the roadmap of the ancient world, we should say more about technology and innovation as forces that traveled as well as originated. In China, for instance, innovations in papermaking and bureaucracy had long-term implications. The earliest true paper appears a bit later, and paper precursors and writing substrates were part of a longer trajectory of record-keeping in East Asia. Mechanical ingenuity, such as attempts to build devices that register seismic activity, shows a culture of practical experimentation. Silk, meanwhile, was a luxury commodity whose production remained largely confined to China, but whose demand created incentives for long journeys and trade networks. In the Indian Ocean, ship technology and navigational knowledge made seasonal voyages possible. Sailors took advantage of the monsoon rhythms, and port cities grew where sea and land routes intersected. That maritime world created opportunities for religious movements, Buddhism, and later other faiths, to cross seas with merchants and monks. Artistic forms like Gandharan sculpture emerged in these contact zones where Greek artistic traditions met Buddhist iconography. The result is a visual language that reveals cross-cultural exchange rather than one culture supplanting another. Political forms also varied widely. Rome's imperial model rested on direct rule and infrastructure. Parthia used a more decentralized federative arrangement. Han China operated through a bureaucratic system that sought to absorb local elites into a state apparatus. Axum's rising power suggests how maritime trade could support state formation in Africa.
And across the Americas, urban centers like Teotihuacan developed organizational forms tuned to their own environments and cosmologies. Different solutions to governance and organization suited different landscapes and social priorities, and none should be read as simply a linear ladder of progress. We should avoid ranking societies by a single yardstick. What counts as an advantage in one context can mean something else entirely in another. One of the recurring surprises when we look at this era is how evidence reshapes assumptions. Archaeological technologies, from LiDAR scanning that reveals hidden plazas beneath jungle canopy to DNA analysis that traces migration patterns, have transformed our understanding of the ancient world in recent decades. LiDAR surveys, for example, have exposed vast urban footprints hidden under forest cover, suggesting greater population and infrastructure than earlier scholars imagined. Remote sensing helps us see that many ancient cities were larger and more complex than surface surveys suggested. Similarly, isotopic analysis of human remains can tell us about diet and mobility. Textile fragments, though rare, reveal trade patterns and technological skill. These scientific tools do not solve every puzzle, but they do give us new pieces to assemble. And yet, limits remain. Losses like the partial destruction of Alexandria's collections, the decay of perishable materials, and the absence of written records in some regions mean that many aspects of life remain obscure. Where written texts do exist, they often reflect the interests of elites, legal codes, temple inscriptions, and administrative lists. The everyday lives of women, children, and lower status laborers are often harder to recover. That's a methodological caution. Our picture of the past is always mediated by what survives and by the questions we ask of those remains. Still, even with those limits, patterns emerge that are both connective and surprising. Long-distance exchange made possible the spread of crops, animals, and technologies. Buddhism crossed from India into Central and East Asia in waves across land and sea. Christianity began as a local movement in the Eastern Mediterranean and would eventually be carried across empires. Artistic forms traveled with craftsmen and with the goods they decorated. The movement of objects often carried ideas in their pockets. A statue, a coin, a pottery form, or a script could introduce new aesthetics or new administrative practices to a distant place. Consider, too, the visual languages that have come down to us as clues. Coins are small but rich documentary sources. The portraits and inscriptions on coinage tell us about rulers, propaganda, and economic connections. Pottery styles help archaeologists track interaction spheres because ceramics travel with people and goods. Monumental architecture, pyramids in Mesoamerica, stelae in Axum, temples and baths in Rome, leaves a landscape of stone that hints at organization, ideology, and labor management. Sculpture, iconography, and inscriptions all offer windows, but each requires careful interpretation and cross-checking with other evidence. Let's return for a moment to the Americas to underline a few specifics that deserve nuance. In central Mexico, Teotihuacan's rise shows urban planning on a scale that questions older ideas about the uniqueness of old-world urbanism. Its Avenue of the Dead, massive pyramids, and apartment compounds indicate a complex society with specialized craftsmen, religious specialists, and extensive trade connections within Mesoamerica. The Maya, in their lowland cities, developed a writing system and calendrical mathematics that allowed precise astronomical records. Their intellectual tradition shows observational continuity and innovation, which later generations and archaeologists can trace through stelae and codices, though many of the latter survive only in fragmentary form. In South America, coastal sambaquis, earthworks, and ceramic sequences reveal regional complexity and adaptation to local ecologies. Across these regions, evidence suggests diverse political experiments and ceremonial life, often with cosmological logics quite different from those of Eurasia. Throughout this journey, one theme returns: human ingenuity in context. People everywhere adapted to their environment, found ways to organize labor, and invented items that fit their needs. The Han bureaucrat's scroll and the Maya astronomer's observatory both record complex institutions of knowledge. The Axumite stele and the Teotihuacan pyramid both signal ways societies memorialized power and belief. We should appreciate the diversity of solutions rather than force comparisons that treat one culture as the measure of all others. As we approach the end of this tour, it helps to reflect on why we still call some facts secrets. The term can mislead if it promises a final revelation, but it also captures the feeling of uncovering something unexpected from fragments. A single inscription found in the mud beneath a plaza can change how historians date a site. A margin note in a damaged scroll can rewrite an intellectual lineage. New technologies, LIDAR, ancient DNA, isotope chemistry, and digital epigraphy have turned whispered possibilities into testable hypotheses. That is the real thrill of studying the ancient world.
Each discovery invites us to reconfigure our mental maps. So what can we take away from this panorama? First, that the world around the 1st century CE was not a simple hierarchy of development, but a mosaic of interacting systems, an enormous, dynamic patchwork. Second, that simultaneity matters. Intellectual, political, and material developments were unfolding at the same time across oceans and continents.
Third, that connectivity, both overland and maritime, shaped how people, goods, and ideas spread, and often these networks were more resilient and more extensive than earlier scholars assumed. Finally, that our knowledge is provisional. New finds complicate old narratives and force us to live with uncertainty. If there is a single image to close on, it is this. Imagine a map overlaid with many tiny paths, some drawn in stone roads, some in shipping lanes traced by monsoon winds, some in the routes of migrating peoples. Each path carries goods, each path carries news, and each path carries people who rearrange the landscape in small but cumulative ways. When we place a figure like Jesus against that map, he's not isolated, but part of a crowded, busy world, a world of scholars, traders, craftsmen, farmers, rulers, sailors, and priests, all of whom left marks that survive in uneven ways. If you want to dive deeper, the description below contains references to primary sources and recent scholarship, plus playlists for focused episodes on Alexandria, Han China, Teotihuacan, and the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean. Each of those topics can be a whole series on its own because they reach into the lives of millions and into technologies that reshaped the planet over centuries. Thank you for joining this global tour of what the world looked like 2,000 years ago. If this stirred your curiosity, watch our next video for a focused deep dive into the Library of Alexandria and the scholars who tried to measure the Earth. Check the description for sources and suggested reading, and keep asking the questions that make history feel alive.